The wind had a voice this high in the Wyoming Territory, and tonight it used it to scream. It was the 28th of December, 1887, and the sound scouring the blackness of Thunder Basin was not a human one, but it was hungry. It clawed at the thin pine boards of Elias Mercer's cabin, forcing needles of ice and dry, scouring snow through invisible cracks. The sound was a physical weight, a constant, shrieking pressure that threatened to bow the walls inward, inside. Elias moved with the deliberate economy of a man who lives by subtraction. Every motion was measured against the cold. He was tall, but starvation and winter had stooped him, carving hollows under his cheekbones. He leaned over the cast iron stove, the only source of light and life in the one-room world. The lid lifter was cold in his hand. He stirred the pot, scraping the bottom. It was the last of it, a thin slurry of beans, mealy and gray, with a few remaining strings of dried venison. It was not enough. It would not be enough tomorrow. Beside the stove, stacked with the care of holy relics, were 4 pieces of split pine, his remaining fuel. He counted them again, a habit born of desperation. 4 logs to stand between him and a temperature that froze the marrow. His gaze drifted from the wood to the object draped over the back of his one chair. It was a wool blanket, dyed a long-forgotten shade of blue, now frayed to a pale, ghostly gray. The edges were tattered, and a long, L-shaped tear ran through the middle, patched poorly with fishing line. It was thin, and it smelled of old smoke and pine resin and the faint, metallic tang of his own sweat. It was the most valuable thing he owned. It was the only thing that held heat. He ate his portion straight from the pot, standing, listening. The wind was his only companion, and it was a foul team. The wind had a voice this high in the Wyoming Territory, and tonight it used it to scream. It was the 28th of December, 1887, and the sound scouring the blackness of Thunder Basin was not a human one, but it was hungry. It clawed at the thin pine boards of Elias Mercer's cabin, forcing needles of ice and dry, scouring snow through invisible cracks. The sound was a physical weight, a constant, shrieking pressure that threatened to bow the walls inward, inside. Elias moved with the deliberate economy of a man who lives by subtraction. Every motion was measured against the cold. He was tall, but starvation and winter had stooped him, carving hollows under his cheekbones. He leaned over the cast-iron stove, the only source of light and life in the one-room world. The lid lifter was cold in his hand. He stirred the pot, scraping the bottom. It was the last of it, a thin slurry of beans, mealy and gray, with a few remaining strings of dried venison. It was not enough. It would not be enough tomorrow. Beside the stove, stacked with the care of holy relics, were 4 pieces of split pine, his remaining fuel. He counted them again, a habit born of desperation. 4 logs to stand between him and a temperature that froze the marrow. His gaze drifted from the wood to the object draped over the back of his one chair. It was a wool blanket, dyed a long-forgotten shade of blue, now frayed to a pale, ghostly gray. The edges were tattered, and a long, L-shaped tear ran through the middle, patched poorly with fishing line. It was thin, and it smelled of old smoke and pine resin and the faint, metallic tang of his own sweat. It was the most valuable thing he owned. It was the only thing that held heat. He ate his portion straight from the pot, standing, listening. The wind was his only companion, and it was a foul-tempered one. It offered no comfort, only the constant, high-pitched reminder of oblivion. He was banking the last of the embers, preparing to wrap himself in the blanket and pass into the frozen stillness that passed for sleep, when a new sound cut through the gale. It was not a knock. No one knocked. It was a heavy, sodden thump against the adjoining barn wall, followed by the desperate, explosive snort of a horse in distress. Elias froze. Every instinct screamed to ignore it. Opening a door tonight was suicide. It was inviting the White Death into his home, stealing the pitiful warmth he had cultivated. But the sound of the horse, a choked, liquid sound of pure exhaustion, moved him. It was a creature in its final extremity. He grabbed the blanket from the chair, wrapping it around his own shoulders. He lit his storm lantern, the small flame fighting against the drafts. He pulled his hat low and unbarred the connecting door to the lean-to barn, a space only slightly less cold than the outside world. He had to put his shoulder to the main barn door. A drift had already climbed halfway up. He shoved, the old hinges screaming, and a whirlwind of ice and snow blasted into the small space, extinguishing his lantern instantly. He was plunged into a roaring, tactile darkness. He smelled the horse before he saw it, the scent of fierce sweat and frozen breath. He heard it take one stumbling step and then collapse. The sound, a final, heavy sigh of bone and hide hitting the packed earth. Elias struck a match, cupping it with his body. The small flame illuminated a scene from a frozen hell. A roan gelding lay on its side, its chest heaving and shallow. Ragged bursts. Its coat was a solid armor of ice, and slumped beside it, half buried in the drift that had surged in, was a shape. It was not a person. It was a mound of frozen fabric. He moved. The blanket clenched around him. He touched the mound, and his hand recoiled. It was as hard as frozen wood. He brushed the snow away and saw the dark, soaked wool of a woman's riding skirt. She was face down. He put his bare hand to her neck under a hood crusted with ice, and felt nothing. No pulse, just the unyielding cold of a stone. But as he pulled his hand away, he saw her own. Her mitten was gone. Her hand was bare, blue-white, and clutched with inhuman strength to the handle of a small, dark leather satchel. That, more than anything, told him she had been alive. "Damn it," he whispered, the word stolen by the wind. He left the horse. It was done. He hooked his arms under the woman's shoulders, breaking the crust of ice that held her to the ground. She was heavier than a sack of feed, a dead weight of water and ice. He dragged her, backwards, out of the snow and into the cabin, shoving the barn door closed with his boot. A cloud of fine, powdered snow and her own frozen breath followed them, settling on the floor. He laid her on the bare planks near the hearth. She was a ruin. Ice was matted in her hair, which had come loose from its pins and was frozen in dark strands to her cheek. Her lips were not blue. They were a deep, bruised purple, parted slightly. He worked with a desperate, panicked roughness. He grabbed one of his remaining logs and split it, throwing the kindling and larger pieces into the stove. He needed heat. Now. The fire caught with a hungry roar. He couldn't get her dress off. The buttons were frozen solid. He took his skinning knife from his belt and slit the back of the heavy bodice, the sound of the blade on the frozen fabric like tearing thick paper. He cut away the icy layers until he got to her chemise, which was soaked and cold but not frozen through. He fetched the blanket, his blanket. He unfolded it, the worn wool scraping his cold fingers. For a second, he hesitated, looking from her still form to his own shivering hands. He made the choice. He laid the blanket over her, tucking it tight, then went to his cot and pulled his own thin mattress ticking, stuffed with dry grass, and laid it over top of her. It wasn't enough. He looked at the stove, glowing a dull red, and then at his own shoulders. He was already shaking, the cold of the room biting deep now that the door had been opened. He took the blanket from his own back, the one he had slept in every night for 5 years. He spread it over her as well. Then, a new thought. He went back to the chair, grabbed the tattered blue blanket, and lifted it off her. With his knife, he sawed at the weakened fishing line patch. He tore the blanket in two. It was a ragged, violent tear. He laid one half over her, tucks it under her chin. The other, smaller half, he wrapped around his own shoulders, huddling on the floor between her and the stove. He watched her. The only warmth in the room was radiating from the iron stove, hitting his face and her body. He could see the heat bouncing off the wool, steam rising from her damp clothes. She was not breathing, or perhaps she was. A breath so shallow it made no movement. He grabbed a tin cup, poured a measure from the brown bottle of rubbing alcohol he kept for his livestock, and began to work. He pulled her hands out from under the blankets. Her fingers were stiff, locked in a claw-like grip. He poured the stinging liquid onto his own hands and began to chafe hers, rubbing hard, trying to force life and heat back into the frozen flesh. Her skin was waxy, unresponsive. "Come on," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, the first words he'd spoken aloud in a week. "You don't get to die here. I won't have it." He worked for an hour, or maybe it was 3. The storm outside changed its pitch, the screaming dropping to a low, guttural moan. The world was defined by the sound of his hands on her skin, the sharp, chemical smell of the alcohol, and the hiss of the wood in the stove. He rubbed her feet, her arms, her neck. He forced warm water from the kettle between her purple lips, most of it dribbling back out. Her hand, the one that had held the satchel, was raw where he had rubbed it. But it was no longer blue. It was a dark, angry red, and it twitched. It was a small thing, a flicker of a finger. Then her whole hand trembled, a violent, rattling shake, like a dry leaf in a high wind. A sound came from her, a low, agonizing groan that ripped through the quiet of the cabin. Her breathing started, not gently, but in a series of harsh, painful gasps, as if she were drowning. Elias sat back on his heels, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. He did not soothe her. He just watched, a sentinel, as she fought her way back. He must have slept, slumped against the wood box, because the next thing he knew, the quality of the light in the cabin had changed. The gaps in the boards were no longer black, but a thin, luminous gray. The storm had passed. The silence was as profound as the noise had been. He heard a sharp intake of breath. His eyes snapped to the hearth. The woman was awake. She had pushed herself up onto one elbow, her eyes wide and animal bright. They were not the hazy eyes of a person saved, but the sharp, assessing eyes of a person cornered. Her gaze darted from him, to the door, to the empty space where her satchel had been. "It's by your head," Elias said. His voice was rough with disuse. She looked. He had placed the small leather bag beside her pillow of hay. Her body relaxed, but only by a fraction. Her eyes returned to him. They were dark, and in the gray light, he could see they were filled with a cold, assessing intelligence. She was calculating. "Who are you?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry, cracked reed. "Elias Mercer, this is my place." She licked her lips, which were split and raw. "Thank you for the fire." He nodded. He didn't want thanks. He wanted to know what trouble she had dragged into his home. He got up, his joints popping in the cold, and poured a cup of warm water from the kettle. He held it out. She watched his hand, his movements, as if expecting a blow. She took the cup with a hand that still trembled, but it was the tremor of adrenaline now, not cold. "My name," she said, her voice low, "is Gwen Price." It was a lie. He knew it the moment she said it. It was too clean, too practiced. It was a name a person had ready. Men like him, men who lived this far out, they knew the sound of a lie. It was the sound of something being built, where only silence should be. Elias Mercer simply nodded again. He did not press. He turned his back to her, a gesture of trust he did not feel, and added the second-to-last log to the stove. He would give her the lie. He would let her keep it. He pointed to the pot of beans. "There's food, when you can stomach it." He turned back. She had not moved, but her gaze was fixed on him, sharp and piercing, the first true shaft of morning light, bright and blinding from the reflection on the snow, cut through a gap in the boards. It struck her face, illuminating the exhaustion, the fear, and the hard, unyielding core beneath it. She watched him for a long, silent minute. She seemed to measure his face, his ragged clothes, the poverty of the small room, and the half of the blanket he had kept for himself. She saw the other half, the matching ragged edge, covering her. Her expression hardened, as if coming to a decision. She let out a long, slow breath. "My real name," she said, and her voice was no longer the dry whisper of Gwen Price, but a low, steady alto that carried the weight of a confession. "Is Sutton Hale." Elias held her gaze. He gave nothing away. He just waited. Sutton Hale. The name meant nothing to him, But the giving of it, the correction of the lie, meant everything. It meant the trouble was real, and it was now inside his walls, as if summoned by the name itself. A shadow moved at the far edge of his property. Elias saw it through the one small, clean pane of glass in his window. A dark shape, a rider on a tall horse, moving slowly along the line of his barbed wire fence. The figure was too distant to make out any features, just a black silhouette against the blinding white of the new dawn. The rider paused, looking toward the cabin. A thin curl of wood smoke, Sutton's wood smoke, rising into the still air. The figure sat motionless for a full minute, a black speck of judgment in an ocean of white. Then, deliberately, the horse was turned, and the rider moved off, disappearing over the rise. Sutton had not seen it. She was still watching him. But Elias knew. He knew the way of the high country. That was no lost traveler. He would check the trail later, but he already knew what he would find. Not the wandering tracks of a man caught in the storm, but the deep, deliberate hoofprints of a scout who had come right up to the line, seen what he needed to see, and turned back to report. The storm had ended. The real trouble was just beginning. The day dawned with a blinding, absolute whiteness. The storm had scoured the world, burying the landscape under a deep, unmarked blanket of snow that reflected the painfully bright, cold sun. The silence was as heavy as the snow itself, broken only by the sharp crack of frozen wood as Elias forced his cabin door open against a drift. He worked for an hour to clear a path to the lean-to, the snow so light and dry it smoked with every shovel full. Sutton Hale emerged from the cabin behind him, her face pale but her eyes clear. She wore a pair of his old wool trousers, cinched at the waist with a length of rope, and her own heavy skirt looked impossibly stiff and dark, drying by the stove. She carried the two halves of the torn blanket, her expression unreadable. Elias had gone to the barn, his shoulders set against the cold. The roan horse had not made it. It lay frozen solid, a monument of ice and hide. He spent a grim 10 minutes salvaging the saddle and bridle, his fingers aching as he worked the frozen buckles. When he turned, Sutton was there, her gaze fixed on the dead animal. She did not flinch, but a small muscle in her jaw tightened. "He was a good horse," she said, her voice flat. "He belonged to a man at the livery. I took him." Elias just nodded, pulling the heavy saddle over his shoulder. "The living need tending." He moved to the damaged barn door, which had been half torn from its leather hinges by the wind. He'd salvaged a square of canvas tarpaulin from a broken wagon, and, together, they stretched it over the gap. Sutton pulled the canvas taut while he nailed it down with numb fingers, her movements quick and efficient. She held the hammer for him when he needed to use both hands, anticipating his needs without a word. From there, they went to the water trough. It was choked with ice 4 inches thick. Elias took his axe, the steel ringing with a high, sharp ping as it struck the frozen surface. It was brutal, repetitive work. Sutton grabbed a pitchfork and began to break the smaller chunks he dislodged, clearing the trough for the animals. His cattle, 5 head of thin, hardy longhorns, huddled in the lee of the barn, their coats frosted with ice. They watched him with dull, hungry eyes. He pitched them hay, the last of his winter store, spreading it thin. Sutton took the fork from him and distributed the feed with a practiced hand, ensuring the weakest of the cows got its share. She did not work like a city woman. She moved with a purpose, her body understanding the rhythms of the labor, and all the while, she was watching. Her gaze swept over everything, noting details with a sharp, systematic precision. Elias saw her eyes linger on the lean-to, measuring its construction. She noted the drainage ditch he had dug by the barn, now full of snow. She looked at the small, padlocked grain store, her eyes assessing its lock, the strength of its door, and the sight lines from the cabin window. She was not just looking. She was memorizing. It was the habit of someone who lived by the recorded word, a mind trained to capture and hold fact. At midday, they retreated to the cabin. The temporary truce of shared labor dissolved, and the silence became heavy again. The small, enclosed space amplified the awareness of each other. Lunch was 2 slabs of dry cornbread and a pot of coffee, brewed from the last scrapings of his bean tin. So weak he could see the bottom of the tin cup. They sat at his small, rough-hewn table. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a mile. They were 2 strangers, bound only by a storm and the roof they shared. "Thank you," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "For the clothes." "They're better than a frozen skirt," he replied, his voice rough. Sutton looked down at her hands, which were red and chapped from the morning's work. "Do you have a needle and thread your shirt?" He glanced down. The hem of his thick wool shirt was unraveling, a long, trailing thread. He hadn't noticed. He got up, went to a small tin box on the shelf, and pulled out a small bone needle case and a spool of black thread. He handed them to her. They were valuable, hard to replace items, and he felt a pang at letting them go. She took them with a small nod. She sat by the stove, the light from the fire catching her face, and began to work. She did not sew quickly. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each stitch precise and small. The needle rose and fell, a tiny, rhythmic flash of steel. It was, Elias thought, like watching her think. The slow, careful pass of the thread was a measure of her thoughts, a way of stitching the world back into some kind of order. She was measuring him, measuring the situation, one stitch at a time. He watched her hands, the way her fingers moved, and felt a strange, unfamiliar quiet settle in his chest. The afternoon light began to fade, the sky turning a pale, cold lavender. The work was not done. He had to check the fence line for drifts that might let his cattle stray. He pulled a spare set of reins from a peg on the wall, the leather stiff and cold. One of the ties was broken. "I need to fix this," he said, more to himself than to her. Sutton looked up from her sewing. "Can I help?" He hesitated. "You know how to tie a slip knot?" She shook her head, putting the mended shirt aside. He moved closer, holding the 2 ends of the leather rein. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of damp wool, pine smoke, and the faint, clean scent of her. "You take the end," he said, his voice lower than he intended. "You loop it, back on itself, like this." He guided the leather, his large, rough fingers moving slowly. She watched, her brow furrowed in concentration. "No, the loop goes under," he corrected, and he reached for her hand to guide it. His fingers closed over hers. The contact was a shock, a sudden jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Her skin was not as soft as he'd imagined. It was firm, capable, but beneath it, her bones felt fine and small. His hand was calloused, scarred, and covered hers completely. They both froze. He could feel the fine, fast tremor in her pulse, or perhaps it was his own. The smell of the cold leather was sharp, but beneath it was her, the human warmth of her. He could see the dark, fine lashes against her cheek as she looked down at their joined hands. A long second stretched. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears. He dropped her hand as if it were a hot coal, taking a clumsy step back. "Like that," he said, his voice strained, clearing his throat. "You pull it tight. It holds." "It holds," she repeated, her voice a quiet breath. She did not look at him, but her gaze was fixed on the knot he had created. Night fell fast, and with it, the wind returned. It rose from a whisper to a moan, and then to a low, keening howl. The brief respite was over. Snow began to tick against the one glass pane, a dry, insistent tapping. They ate the last of the beans, the silence returning, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was charged, aware. The brief, accidental touch had changed the air in the room. The fire in the stove was their anchor. Elias fed it the second-to-last log, knowing he would have to brave the pre-dawn cold to split more. The wind found new ways into the cabin, and the temperature plummeted. Without discussion, they retrieved the 2 halves of the blue blanket. They sat on the floor, their backs against the wood box, sharing the warmth of the stove. Elias draped one half over her shoulders, and she unfolded the other, spreading it across both their laps. He sat close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. He could feel the slightness of her frame, the tension held in her muscles. Their breathing was in sync with the low roar of the stove and the rising shriek of the wind. The air was filled with the smell of burning pine and damp, hot wool. He was staring into the flames, lost in the new, complicated reality of her presence. When the fire flared, a pocket of sap in the wood popped, sending a bright, sudden wash of light across the hearth. It illuminated her face, and he saw it. He had not seen it in the gray dawn light, or in the flat brightness of the day. It was high on her neck, just below her left ear, half hidden by her hair. It was not a bruise. It was a raw, chafed abrasion, the kind of mark left by a coarse rope or a hand that grabbed and held on, grinding skin against a rough collar. His breath caught in his throat. Every instinct, the hard-won caution of a man who had survived by minding his own affairs, told him to look away, to say nothing, but he couldn't. He looked. He saw the story of her terror written on her skin. He did not ask. He did not move, except to reach for a clean rag he kept by the kettle. He dipped it in the hot water, wrung it out, and held it out to her. He said nothing. He just offered the warm, damp cloth. Sutton's eyes, which had been fixed on the fire, snapped to his. She saw him looking at the mark on her neck. She saw the offering in his hand. Her face, which had been pale and controlled, seemed to shatter for a moment. A wave of fear and shame and a deep, profound weariness washed over her features. She did not take the cloth. She turned her gaze away from him, toward the stove. The kettle, a black iron pot, sat on the flat top, its surface reflecting a dark, distorted image of the room. She stared at her own wavering, warped reflection in the black iron. The wind howled, rattling the door in its frame. "I am not a traveler who lost her way," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. Her words were a flat, hard statement, dropped into the small space between them. "I am a person who is hiding." Elias said nothing. He held his ground. The confession hung in the air, a living thing. And then, from outside, another sound cut through the wind. It was not the storm. It was a howl. Elias went still, every sense screaming. It was not his dog. He didn't have one. It was a coyote. But the sound was wrong. It was not the yipping, frantic call of a pack. It was a single, long, deep-chested cry. It held for a beat, then silence. Then it came again, identical, and a third time, 3 howls. Measured, even, it was a signal. Sutton's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a new, sharp terror. She had heard it too. Elias looked toward the dark, frosted window. Someone was out there, in the blizzard. Someone was at his fence line, calling, and they were not lost. The 3 howls hung in the cabin, a frozen, invisible weight. The wind outside seemed to die, holding its breath to honor the signal. Sutton Hale's face, which had been a mask of weary terror, sharpened into something new. It became the face of a person who has run out of time, a person who must now stand and fight or be consumed. "They found me," she said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a flat, concise statement of fact. She got to her feet in one fluid motion, the shared blanket half sliding to the floor. "Who is they?" Elias's voice was a low growl. He stood up with her, his body instinctively placing itself between her and the door. He reached for the Spencer rifle he kept leaning against the wood box, his hand closing over the cool, smooth stock. "Put it down," she said, her voice sharp. "Not yet. If they were coming in, they would have come. That was a signal. They're confirming the location. They'll wait for daybreak, or for their full party." Elias did not put the rifle down, but he did not raise it. He watched her. "You have until daybreak to talk. You're done telling half-truths. Miss Hale, you brought this to my door." "I am," she said, nodding, her breath coming fast. "A stenographer. Or I was. I work for the Territorial Court in Cheyenne. I record. I transcribe. I am paid to be invisible and to have a perfect memory." She spoke in a clipped, rapid cadence, as if dictating a report. Her fear was still present, but it was being channeled into a furious, precise energy. For 6 months, I have been the private transcriptionist for Judge Byron Slate, not just in the courtroom, in his chambers. He dictates his private correspondence, his rulings, his financial ledgers. He believes a woman is too stupid to understand the details, and too timid to speak of them. He is wrong on both counts. She crossed to the hearth and picked up her small leather satchel. She brought it to the table, her hands moving with a practiced, quick efficiency. Judge Slate, she continued, is not a servant of the law. He is a merchant. He sells verdicts. He launders money for the railroad, for the land grant companies, and for any cattle baron who can meet his price. For 6 months, I have been recording his private ledger, a book that does not officially exist. Elias watched, his face grim. A bribery book, she confirmed, her eyes bright and hard. But it is more than that. It is a record of his entire network, who he pays, who pays him, and who he uses for enforcement. 2 nights ago, he called me to his chambers. It was late, after midnight. He was celebrating with a man. She paused, and her hand went unconsciously to the raw mark on her neck. His name is Rook McCready, a cattle driver, a man who moves other people's beef and rebrands it as his own. He and his crew were set to be indicted for the murder of 3 homesteaders down on the Sweetwater, an open and shut case. But I watched Judge Slate hand McCready the grand jury's witness list. He was erasing the case. McCready was grateful. Her voice faltered for just a second. Slate was drunk. He was boasting. He turned to me and said, "Miss Hale, be a dear and strike Mr. McCready's name from all pending dockets, and then add your own name to a list of outstanding accounts." He laughed. He had a small list, written on a piece of telegraph paper. It was a list of 4 names, the 2 witnesses who wouldn't take his bribe, a land surveyor, and me. A list of people to be silenced. Elias said, "It was not a question." McCready didn't like that I had heard it. He did not like that I had seen the list. When the judge left the room for more whiskey, McCready, he showed me what he thought. He grabbed me. He said he preferred to settle accounts himself. She touched her neck. The judge returned before he could finish. He pulled McCready off, angry, calling him a fool. He told me to go home, to forget what I heard. He said I was a valuable asset he would hate to lose. She looked at Elias, her gaze searing. It was not a threat. It was a death sentence, just with a longer timeline. I went to my boarding house. I packed this. She unfastened the 2 buckles on the satchel. She did not show him clothes or money. She pulled out a stack of small, leather-bound notebooks. They were filled with dense, cryptic symbols. "My original shorthand notes," she said. "Every ledger entry, every meeting I transcribed. It's all here, but it is useless without this." She reached into a hidden pocket in the satchel's lining and produced a single, folded piece of paper. It was a cipher key. "This is the piece that translates my personal shorthand, the symbols I invented for his specific crimes, into plain English. Without it, the notes are just scribbles. With it, they are his confession." She laid the cipher on the table between them. "I took a horse from the livery. I knew McCready would be watching the stage routes and the train depot. I rode east, into the storm, thinking I could loop around and make it to the marshal in Laramie. I did not count on the blizzard. I did not count on him. McCready," Elias said. "The howls. The rider at the fence line. He is not just a cattle thief. He is Slate's bloodhound, and he is very, very good at his job." The confession was complete. It lay in the small, warm room, an object as cold and hard as the cipher key. Elias looked from the paper to her face, and then to the Spencer rifle still in his hand. He knew what this meant. This was not a drifter's trouble. This was Cheyenne. This was the law, the railroad, the money. This was Judge Byron Slate, a man who could order the world to his liking. And this was Rook McCready, a man who would burn the world down for $1. Helping her was not just danger. It was suicide. He had his own troubles. He owed money. The bank in Cheyenne, a bank he was certain, now was owned by a friend of Slate's, held the note on his land. They were looking for any reason to foreclose. They had sent a man out last month just to assess the value. The man had looked at his thin cattle and his failing fences and had sneered. He had 30 days. He was 30 days from losing the one thing he had ever built. To be found harboring a fugitive, a woman wanted by Judge Slate. They would not just take his land. They would wipe him from the earth. He would be a footnote in one of Slate's ledgers. He saw the calculation in his own eyes reflected in hers. She was a stenographer. She read men better than they read themselves. She saw his hesitation, the weighing of her life against his land. She did not plead. She did not cry. Her spine straightened. She reached into the pocket of the trousers she wore his trousers and pulled something out. She placed it on the table, next to the cipher. It was a single silver dollar, worn smooth. The likeness of liberty faded to a ghost. "That is my mother's," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the strength of iron. "It is the only thing of value I have on me, besides the truth. If you tell me to go, if you turn me out into the snow to face them, I will understand, and I will still thank you for the fire that saved my life. I will not bring this down on you against your will." She paused, pushing the coin an inch closer to him. "But if you let me stay, if you keep me here, I will not be a victim you are hiding. I will be your partner. I will fight with you for this ranch, for our lives. And when this is over, if we live, I will use the truth in that satchel to see that you never have to worry about that bank again. That is my offer." The cabin was silent. The only sound was the low, steady burn of the fire and the whistle of the wind as it searched for a way in. Elias looked at the coin. He looked at her face, pale and marked by violence, but unbroken. He looked at the rifle in his hand. He thought of the rider at the fence, of the life he had built, a life of dirt and cold and debt. It was not much of a life, but it was his, and they were at his fence. He turned, slowly, and hung the Spencer rifle back on its wooden pegs by the door. It was a simple movement. It was his answer. "You stay," he said, his voice a low gravel. "We don't wait for morning. We plan now. They're on our doorstep. We need to find people we can trust." Relief did not flood her face. Instead, a new, sharp light came into her eyes. The light of a fighter who has just found an ally. "Who?" she asked. Elias turned to the stove, his mind working. "We are not the only ones in this valley who have been pushed, not the only ones who hate Slate and what he represents." He picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth. On the back of a piece of crate wood, he began to write. "Clara Finch," he said. "The schoolteacher in town. She's smart, smarter than any man in this territory. She runs the telegraph office on the side. She knows Morse code. If that cipher of yours is a key, she can help us read it. And she can send a message that Slate's men can't intercept. Josiah Pike," he continued, the charcoal scratching in the quiet. "He was with the 9th Cavalry, fought the Apache. He runs the livery, but no one gives him work because he's black. He knows tactics. He knows how to move without being seen, and he hates this territory for what it's done to him." "One more," Elias said, pausing. "Thomas Sage. He's the blacksmith, Paiute. He doesn't say more than 5 words a year, but he sees everything. He knows the old ways, the paths through the high country that aren't on any map, and he can make anything if we need to get out of a locked room or create a diversion. Thomas is the one." Sutton watched the list grow. Clara, Josiah, Thomas, a schoolteacher, an outcast soldier, and a silent blacksmith. It was not an army. "It is a start," Sutton said, as if reading his mind. She put her hand on the table, next to his. Elias nodded, his face grim. "They are the only ones. We get to them, or we die here." As he spoke, he glanced toward the dark window, far in the distance, on the crest of the same hill where the rider had been at dawn. A tiny, new light appeared. It was a pinprick of orange in the vast, freezing blue of the night. It flared, brightened, and then dimmed, just as a man would. taking a long, slow drag from a cigarette. Rook McCready was still out there, and he was watching the house. They did not wait for dawn. They moved in the dead, frozen dark, 2 hours before the sun would rise, when the cold was at its most lethal and watchers were at their least vigilant. Elias led the way, his Spencer now firmly in his grip, his steps silent on the squeaking, packed snow. He did not lead them to the small town, but to a ruin 2 miles north, the skeletal remains of the valley's first church, burned out 5 years prior by a prairie fire. Only the foundation and the heavy, cast-iron bell, now sitting crooked on the ground, remained, one by one. The others arrived, materializing from the gray landscape like ghosts. Clara Finch came first, a small, bird-like woman wrapped in so many shawls she looked twice her size. She carried a heavy wooden box. Josiah Pike was next, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose every movement was precise, economical. He carried a surplus army carbine. Last came Thomas Sage, the blacksmith. He was compact, powerful, and moved with a silence that was unsettling. He brought a heavy canvas satchel that clinked softly. They met in the old root cellar beneath the church, a damp, earthen hollow shielded from the wind. A single lantern cast huge, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Clara Finch set her box on a rotting crate. "I came when you called, Elias, but the line was active." Someone was listening. She opened the box, revealing an old, portable telegraph key and a small battery. "This is from the old relay station. It's not connected to the main line. It's safe." Sutton Hale, who had been a silent, pale shadow, stepped forward into the lantern light. She unbuckled her satchel. "Miss Finch," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I have notes. Can you read Morse?" "Like I read my name," Clara said, her sharp eyes taking in Sutton, the mark on her neck, the set of her jaw. "Then we can talk." Sutton said. She placed her cipher key on the crate. "My shorthand is a code, but the judge's code, that's the real problem." For the next hour, a strange music filled the cellar. Clara would tap the key. A quick, rhythmic clack, clack, clack. Sutton would listen, her eyes closed, and then read from her notebook, her voice a low, melodic chant. 3 dots, pause dash, that's railroad bond, dash, dot, dash. Silver shipment. He used a simplified Morse, but he reversed the meanings for any word related to money. "He's arrogant," Clara said, her fingers flying. "He made a code he thought only he was smart enough to use, but he was lazy." She hit a final, sharp series of taps. "There, that's the last of it. We have the translation key for his entire financial network." "But his notes aren't the original," Sutton said, her face grim. "He keeps a master ledger, a thick, leather-bound book with an eagle tooled on the cover. My notes are just a copy, a transcript. A good lawyer Slate's lawyer will tear them apart as hearsay. We need the original, the book itself." "Then we need to get to Cheyenne," Elias said. "And we need to get out of this valley." Josiah Pike, who had been standing in the deepest shadow, stepped forward. He unrolled a topographical map, yellowed and creased, on the ground. "Cheyenne is not the problem," Josiah said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that rumbled in the small space. "Getting past the men between here and there is— McCready has the roads watched. The main pass into the Laramie Range is a bottleneck. He'd have 2 men on it, and they'd see us coming from 5 miles off." His finger, scarred and dark, traced a thin, wavering line on the map. "But there's another way. The old trapper's route goes right through here." He tapped a tight, dark V on the map. "Cougar Notch, it's high, it's narrow, and it's fast. But it's barely a goat path. One slip and you're down 1,000 feet. McCready's men won't be there," Elias stated. "No," Josiah agreed, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. "They won't. They're paid to be guards, not mountaineers. They'll expect us to take the road. The Notch will put us over the range and down onto the plain before they even know we're gone." As Josiah spoke, Thomas Sage unrolled his canvas satchel. He did not speak, but laid his creations out on the packed earth, each one a piece of brutal, simple logic. First, he placed 2 heavy iron hooks, sharpened to a wicked point, with loops of thick leather strapping. They were climbing hooks, meant to bite into wood or ice. Next, he laid out a peculiar-looking object, a small, hollowed block of wood, fitted with a brass plate that looked like a keyhole. Beside it was a set of intricate, thin steel picks. "A false lock," Clara Finch whispered, her eyes wide. "If you pick a lock, you can't leave it open. You place this over the keyhole. It looks locked. It buys you time." Finally, Thomas produced a small, tightly wrapped tube of thick paper, sealed on both ends with wax. It was heavy for its size. "What is it?" Elias asked, touching the tube. Thomas Sage looked up, his dark eyes meeting Elias's. He spoke, his voice a low, rough sound, as if pulling the words from the earth itself. "Diablo's breath." He tapped the tube. Match heads, soot, sulfur, a little sugar. "A blind mine," Josiah said, his eyes lighting with professional respect. "You light that fuse, it'll put out enough thick, black smoke to blind a man for a full minute. A good minute." Elias looked at the tools that translated code, the high-risk map, the specialized hardware. It was a plan born of desperation and rough-hewn genius. "We need supplies," Elias said, his mind practical. "Food for 3 days, grain for the horses, and a pack mule, if we can find one. We leave our animals behind and take fresh ones from Josiah's livery. It'll cost." He looked at Sutton, at the silver dollar she had offered. It wasn't enough. Not for this. He thought of his ranch, of the sparse, cold life it offered. "I have a spare saddle, a good one, my father's. It's the only other thing I have." He did not have to say more. The sale was a sacrifice they all understood. Selling a spare saddle in this territory was like selling a spare lung. It was an act of final, burning the bridges commitment. He would ride out with them, and he would have no way to return, no backup if his primary gear failed. He was all in. 2 days later, the small team reconvened in the cellar. Elias moved with a grim, tight-lipped anger. He had sold the saddle, and the $2.50 he got for it felt like a handful of grave dirt. He had bought dried beef, hardtack, and oats. Clara Finch arrived, her face pale, holding a folded telegraph slip. "It's not good news. Elias, I intercepted this. It's from the bank in Cheyenne, the one run by Slate's cousin." She handed him the paper. He read it, his face turning to stone. "They're calling the note," he said, the words flat and dead. "They say I'm in default for failure to maintain the property. They're foreclosing. 30 days. They're taking the ranch in 30 days. A suffocating silence filled the cellar. This was Slate's power. He did not just send men with guns. He sent men with paper, with laws he had twisted into weapons. Sutton Hale, who had been watching Elias's face, stepped forward. "No," she said, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, clear rage. "He will not take this." She looked at Elias, her eyes finding his. "This changes the plan. We don't just need the ledger to save ourselves. We need it to save your home." "How?" Elias said, his voice raw. "In 30 days, it's impossible. We need a lawyer. We need money we don't have." "Then we get it," Sutton said, her mind working with the same speed as Clara's telegraph key. "Elias, your cattle, the lightweight calves you were going to winter over, they're worthless," he said. "Skin and bone." "Not in Cheyenne," she said. "Not if they're sold as a distressed lot. It's a cover. We drive them to the city. It's the perfect reason for you to be there. No one questions a rancher, even a poor one, trying to sell his stock before the bank takes it. It's desperate, and it's normal. It gives us a reason to be on the streets, a reason to be at the stockyards. And the money we get, it won't be much. But it'll be enough to hire Martha Coulter." "Martha Coulter?" Clara asked. "The woman who defends the homesteaders. She's good, but she's expensive. She's independent," Sutton said. "And she hates Judge Slate more than any of us. The money will be a retainer. It will be our insurance. When we have that ledger, she'll be the one to use it. A new, daring, and terrifying plan began to form. The target was no longer just escape. It was a counterattack. "The ledger," Sutton said, her voice low, "is kept at the Haviland Hotel. It's Slate's real office. He doesn't keep it at the courthouse. He keeps it in his suite, in a floor safe, a 2-ton Eagle model." Josiah Pike whistled, low. "An eagle you don't crack an eagle? You'd need dynamite, and the whole hotel would know it." "You don't," Sutton said. "If you have the combination, and Slate is a man of arrogant habits. He believes he is the only one who knows it, but he writes it down. He's afraid to forget it. He keeps it in a small, locked desk drawer in the same room. The key to that drawer, he keeps it on his person." The plan was audacious, a piece of intricate, interlocking clockwork. "So, we have 2 objectives," Elias summarized, the spark of a fight re-entering his eyes. "We get the ledger, and we get out. We need a diversion," Josiah said. "A big one. The Haviland is the nicest building in the territory. It's crawling with staff, and with Slate's personal men." Sutton looked at Elias, and a new kind of understanding passed between them. "We'll be the diversion," she said. "I used to run dispatches from the courthouse to the Haviland. They know my face, but only as a telegraph runner. I'll dress the part. I'll go to the front desk, demanding to deliver an urgent government dispatch directly to Slate. I'll make a scene. I'll insist." Elias picked up the thread, his mind seeing the chaos. "And while she's pulling every eye to the front desk, I'll be at the side entrance, a drunk teamster, trying to deliver a barrel of whiskey that's not wanted. I'll accidentally drop it. I'll block the hallway. I'll yell. I will be the loudest, most obnoxious fool in Cheyenne. It's a good plan." Josiah said, 2 points of chaos. It'll split their attention. It gives me and Thomas, say, 10 minutes. "And Clara?" Elias asked. "I'll be at my print shop, 2 blocks away," Clara said, her small face grim. "I'll be watching the hotel's rear entrance. When I see you're clear, I'll ring the shop bell." She looked at them, one by one. Not 1 ring, not 2, 3 consecutive bells. Fast. That's the signal. That means you're out. That means you run, and God help us all. They hit Bitter Creek at the blue hour, that cold, dead time between sundown and full dark. The creek itself was a betrayal. It was not a gentle ford, but a gaping wound in the landscape, 100 feet wide, choked with a slurry of fast-moving black water and jagged plates of ice. The banks were not earth, but shelves of frozen mud, polished by the wind to a glass-like slickness. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, and a low, freezing mist hung over the water, clinging to their clothes. Elias, Sutton, and Thomas Sage were moving their horses single file along the ridge when Elias held up a hand. The sound was faint, a single chink of metal on stone, carried on the wind. He didn't need to say anything. They had been seen. He pointed, not up toward Cougar Notch, but down, at the treacherous ford. "We go through, now." They spurred their horses down the treacherous slope, sliding the last 10 feet onto the ice-covered riverbank. And the trap was sprung. From the opposite bank, 4 riders materialized from the purple shadows. One held a single, spitting pine knot torch high, illuminating the scene. The man at their center was unmistakable. He was broad-shouldered, wore a long, dark duster, and sat his horse with an easy, arrogant grace. Rook McCready. "Well, well," his voice boomed across the water, amplified by the cold, still air. "The little court mouse and the dirt farmer. You've led me a fine chase. Miss Hale, hand over the satchel, and I'll let your man here die quick." The other 3 men fanned out, their rifles glinting in the torchlight. They had them, pinned against the water, with an icy, unclimbable bank behind them and death in front. Elias did not waste a second on negotiation. He drew his Spencer, not to fire, but to gesture. He slammed his heels into his horse's flanks, driving it off the bank and into the churning, icy water. "Go, Sutton, go!" The water was a shock, a brutal, numbing cold that stole the breath. His horse screamed in protest but obeyed, its hooves slipping and cracking on the rocky, uneven bottom. Sutton was right behind him. She drove her horse in, her face a pale, grim mask. Thomas Sage brought up the rear. A shot cracked, the sound echoing flatly. A bullet skipped off the ice, sending a spray of frozen water into Sutton's face. "Don't kill her!" Rook roared, his voice laced with fury. "But shoot the horses! Shoot the men! I want her alive!" Another shot. Thomas Sage's pack mule, the one carrying their food and Elias's sold saddle money, grunted and fell, disappearing under the black water with a heavy, final splash. They were halfway across, in the deepest, fastest part of the channel. Elias was pulling his horse, forcing it diagonally against the current, fighting for the far bank. Sutton, soaked and freezing, did not just flee. She reined in her horse for one impossible second, the animal rearing in the churning water. She dropped her reins, drew the revolver Elias had given her from her belt, and raised it with both hands. She was a stenographer. She understood precision. She aimed for the light. She fired. The single shot was lost in the chaos, but the result was immediate. The torch on the far bank exploded in a shower of orange sparks. And then, with a sharp hiss, it was gone. The world plunged into an absolute, blinding darkness. The only sounds were the roar of the water, the panicked, screaming horses, and Rook's voice cursing, "You fool, light another, light it," in that black, chaotic void. Thomas Sage made his move. He had dropped back, letting the current carry him a few yards. He pulled the Diablo's breath from his coat, struck a sulfur match against his saddle horn, and lit the fuse. He did not drop it. He threw it, his arm moving in a powerful, precise arc. The small, paper-wrapped tube landed on the far bank, right between the dismounted gunmen and their tethered horses. It did not explode with a bang. It was a low, concussing thwomp. A massive, instantaneous cloud of thick, black, sulfurous smoke erupted, blanketing the bank. It was a physical thing, a choking, blinding wall of soot and burning sulfur. The gunmen, already blind from the loss of the torch, were now suffocating. They coughed, gagging, but it was the horses that broke the pursuit. Their tethers were still tied. The animals, terrified by the shots, the concussing sound, and the acrid smell of the smoke, went insane. They reared, screaming, pulling against the picket line. One man, trying to light a new torch, was struck by a hoof and went down. The horses surged, snapping the line, and bolted. A mad, dark stampede of panic, crashing through their own masters. Rook McCready's pursuit, in a single, brilliant moment, was broken. They were on foot, blinded, and their animals were gone. "We're clear!" Elias yelled, his horse finding purchase on the far bank. He was up, turning, reaching for Sutton's rein. "Elias!" She was in trouble. Her horse had made it, but the bank was a sheer sheet of black ice, hidden by a dusting of fresh snow. As she tried to dismount, her feet went out from under her. She lost her balance. A small, desperate cry torn from her throat. She didn't just stumble, she fell, backward, sliding down the glassy surface toward the deep, fast-moving channel. Elias didn't think. He dropped his own reins. He threw himself forward, lunging. His hand, numb and raw, caught the thick fabric of her coat, his momentum, her falling weight. He couldn't stop them. He just held on. They crashed, hard, a tangle of limbs, tumbling off the high bank. They fell, not into the water, but into a deep drift of snow and mist that had collected at the base of the bank, sheltered under the heavy, low-hanging boughs of a massive, ancient juniper bush. The world vanished. They were in a pocket of absolute silence and cold. He was half on top of her, his body shielding hers from the icy ground. His hand was still a vice grip on her coat. Her face was inches from his, her eyes wide, black pools in the darkness. Above them, they heard the remaining gunmen, crashing through the brush on the opposite bank. Where did they go? I lost me. They're in the water. Then a new sound, closer, the jingle of a bridle, the heavy, crunching steps of a single horse. It stopped, directly above their hiding place. They could hear the animal's hot, snorting breath. They could smell the sweat. Rook. Elias's hand, instantly, instinctively, clamped over Sutton's mouth. Shh. She was shaking, a violent rattling tremor, not from cold, but from sheer terror and adrenaline. He could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of her heart against his ribs. Her lips were parted, her breath hot and fast against his palm. The world stopped. There was only the sound of the creek, the jingle of Rook's harness, and the two of them, hidden, not breathing. He looked down at her. Her eyes were locked on his. He saw the mark on her neck. Stark and pale. He saw the terror, and he saw the fight. In that frozen, impossible moment, with death standing 10 feet above them, the world shrank to the space between their two faces. The fear was a current, an electric charge, passing between them. He moved his hand, not away. He slid it from her mouth to her jaw, his thumb resting on the pulse that beat a frantic rhythm at her throat. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of love or of tenderness. It was a kiss of panic, of desperation, a collision in the dark. It was short, hard, and frantic, a desperate, unspoken, "You are alive. I am alive. We are in this." His lips were cold and wet from the river. Hers were impossibly, shockingly warm. It was the only living thing in a world of ice. It lasted a single, concussive heartbeat. They broke apart, both of them stunned, their breaths mingling in a small, white cloud. Above them, Rook McCready cursed. A low, savage sound. "They're gone. They must be downstream. Spread out. Find the horses. Find them!" The single set of hoofbeats crunched, turned, and moved away, fading into the night. They were alone. They were safe. They were hidden in the cold mist. They didn't move for a long, silent minute. The sounds of the search faded. Sutton was breathing in short, shallow gasps, on the verge of sobbing. Elias let go of her, shifting his weight. The spell was broken. "We have to move. We're exposed." He started to crawl out, but her hand shot out, grabbing the front of his wet shirt, clutching it with a desperate strength. "Elias." He stopped, looking back at her. In the darkness of the juniper hollow, she pulled herself up, her body shaking. She pressed her forehead against his, her skin icy and damp. He could feel her trembling. "Don't do that," she whispered, her voice a ragged, breathless sound. Don't risk yourself. Not for me. If I fall back." He cut her off, his own voice raw, thick with an emotion that terrified him. He put his hand over hers, covering her small, cold fingers with his own. "Then I fall with you," he said. It was not a choice. It was a fact. It was a promise made in the dark, and it settled the air between them, solid as a stone. He helped her up. They crawled from the bushes into the night. Their horses were gone, vanished with the stampede. All their supplies, the food, the money, the climbing hooks gone. They were on foot, soaked, and the temperature was dropping. "Josiah," Elias said, his mind already working. "He'll be flanking. He'll be looking for us. We have to let him know." He scanned the bank, found what he was looking for. A flat stone, a round one, a small, sharp pebble. He stacked them, a simple, unnatural-looking pile on the dark ice. "We are here. We are on foot. We are alive." The world was fully dark now. The sky was a vast, cold spray of stars, and the Laramie Range was no longer a distant line of peaks, but a single, solid black wall, looming over them. Sutton shivered, the adrenaline draining away, leaving the lethal, biting cold. "Where do we go, Elias? I can't feel my feet." He pointed north toward a dark gap in the hills. "There, the old postal station at Fort Laclede. It's abandoned." "But it has walls. It has a roof." He took her hand. It was not a gesture of tenderness. It was a necessity, a tether. Her hand was a block of ice in his. "We walk," he said, his voice hard. or we die here." He pulled her up the bank, and together they disappeared into the darkness. Josiah had found them by the river, two shivering, half-drowned figures on a bank of black ice. He had appeared from the darkness as silent as Thomas Sage, his face a mask of grim efficiency. He had stripped them of their soaked outer layers, replacing them with a dry, coarse wool blanket and a long canvas duster from his own bedroll. He had handed them a canteen and a strip of dried beef. His orders were simple. "Thomas is ahead, on foot. He will go to Cheyenne. He will wait. You two, go high. Follow the ridge. I will find you." And he had. 2 days they had walked, climbing into the foothills of the Laramie Range, the air thinning, the world growing vast and silent. Now they were camped in a shallow draw, a dip in the grassy, wind-scoured shoulder of a hill. The wind had a different voice up here, not a scream, but a low, constant, rushing sigh. It carried the sharp, clean, medicinal smell of sagebrush. Elias had made a fire, small and hot, tucked into a V of black rock. It was a cold camp, its smoke thin and scattered by the wind, invisible to anyone not directly above them. Above, the sky was a revelation. It was not a ceiling, but an abyss, punched through with a million, billion pinpricks of icy light. The stars were so bright they seemed to buzz. Sutton sat as close to the fire as she could, her knees drawn to her chest, the heavy wool blanket wrapped around her. She was staring into the flames, but she was not seeing them. She was seeing the black, churning water of Bitter Creek, the flash of gunfire, the feeling of falling, the suffocating, brutal cold. A shiver took her, a violent, rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the shock, the terror, finally catching up, draining the last of her strength. Elias watched her. He sat on the other side of the small fire, his face hard, carved by the flickering light. He had been checking the percussion caps on his revolver, his movements economical and precise. He saw the shiver. He heard the small, hitching breath she tried to hide. He stood, the old blanket Josiah's spare in his hand. He walked around the fire. He sat down behind her, so close his knees brushed her back. She tensed, a rigid line. "You are shaking," he said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. His voice was a low rumble. He did not ask permission. He unfolded the blanket, a thick, coarse army-issue thing that smelled of wool and old smoke. He draped it over her shoulders, then, with the same motion, wrapped it around his own. He pulled her back, gently but firmly, until her back was pressed against his chest. He enveloped her in the blanket, in his own solid presence, creating a small, shared tent of warmth. "It is warmer this way," he said, his voice practical. For a long, silent moment, she remained rigid, a bird frozen in the hand of a hawk. Then, a long, shuddering sigh escaped her. The tension drained from her shoulders. The cold, hard ground was gone, replaced by the solid wall of his body. He was a furnace. He was a rock. She let herself lean into him. It was the first time in her life she had ever fully leaned on anyone. Hesitantly, she lifted a hand, placing it on his forearm where it was wrapped around her. She felt the bunched, hard muscle under his shirt. She moved her hand, spreading her fingers over his chest, over the coarse wool of his shirt, and she felt it, under her palm, deep beneath the layers of cloth and muscle, was the slow, steady, powerful beat of his heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was the most profound sound she had ever heard. It was not the frantic clicking of a telegraph key. It was not the gavel of a corrupt judge. It was not the roar of a frozen river. It was the rhythm of life, steady, patient, and strong. It was the sound of an anchor, holding fast in a storm. It was, she thought, what a home must sound in the dark. The silence between them stretched, comfortable, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the high, thin song of the wind. "I have never been this high," she whispered, her voice small, her gaze on the spray of stars. "It is the only place to be," he replied, his breath stirring her hair. "The air is clean. You can see what is coming." "I did not see this coming," she said, a trace of bitterness in her voice. He was quiet for a moment. Neither did I. She tilted her head back, resting it against his shoulder. You are a quiet man, Elias Mercer, but your heart is loud. A small, rough sound, almost a laugh, vibrated in his chest, and she felt it under her hand. It has not had much to say for many years. Why did you stay? She asked, the question that had been burning in her. At the ranch. You could have turned me out. He did not answer immediately. He stared into the fire. My father. He was a drinker. A man who... He saw weakness, and he fed on it. He sold my mother's locket for a bottle. He sold his vote for $2. He taught me, by his example, what not to be. I do not turn my back on people who are cornered. It is not a thing I am built to do. He had never spoken these words aloud. They felt strange, heavy in the cold air. She processed this, her fingers tightening on his shirt. My mother, she said, her voice matching his. A confession for a confession. She worked at the land office, typing. She taught me shorthand when I was 10, but she taught me other things. Be invisible, Sutton, she would say. The quiet person in the corner is the one who truly hears. Never trust a man who smiles while he talks about power. Sutton looked into the fire. I lived by that. I was quiet. I was invisible. And it was all a lie. I heard everything. But I had no power. Just a list of facts that could get me killed. You are not invisible. Sutton Hale, he said, his voice rough. You shot the torch from that man's hand. You are here. The fire, the shared confessions, the intimacy of their shared warmth. It shifted the air between them. It was no longer the air of a rescuer and a victim. It was something else. She turned, a slow, deliberate movement within the circle of his arms, within the cocoon of the blanket. She was facing him now, her knees pressed against his. The firelight was full on her face, and he saw the exhaustion, the fear, but also the sharp, unbending intelligence. He saw her. Her eyes were dark, and the fire danced in them. Two tiny, wild flames. Her gaze dropped to his mouth, then rose to meet his eyes. It was a question, silent and profound. He did not move. He waited. This was her choice. The kiss at the creek had been panic, a collision of fear and adrenaline. This was not the creek. She leaned in. He met her, his head dipping to capture her mouth. It was the second time he had kissed her, but it was the first time he had kissed her. It was slow. It was not a collision, but a discovery. His lips were chapped. Hers were soft. It was tentative, then firm. It was the taste of smoke and sage and the faint, metallic tang of fear. It was a question, and it was an answer. She put her hand on his jaw, her fingers cold against his skin, and the kiss deepened. It became a long, slow, burning thing. It was all the unspoken words, all the shared fear, all the desperate, clawing hope. It was a promise of life in the face of death. His pulse, so steady beneath her hand just moments before, began to hammer, a wild rhythm that matched her own. He moved his hand from her back, sliding it to her waist, his fingers gripping the rough fabric, pulling her closer. The heat was no longer just from the fire. It was a low, urgent burn, starting deep inside them. Her breath hitched, a small, trembling sigh against his mouth. And then, she broke it. She pulled back, her breath coming in ragged, short gasps. Her face was flushed, her lips fuller, her eyes wide and luminous. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, as if to hold the feeling there. Elias, she whispered, her voice raw. He waited, his own breathing unsteady. I want, she began, then stopped, searching for the words. I want to be close to you. I want this, but I cannot. She looked at him, her gaze unflinching, filled with a desperate, beautiful honesty. I do not want to be a woman who takes comfort in the dark because she is afraid. I want to choose. I want to be Sutton Hale, the woman who chose you. Not Sutton Hale, the runaway who needed you. I want a moment that is not stolen, A moment when fear is not in the room with us, when this is done. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. The fire in his blood, so quick to rise, banked, replaced by a wave of something else. A profound, aching respect, a tenderness that was almost painful. She was not a woman who would be defined by her fear or by her gratitude. He nodded, a single, slow acknowledgement. He reached up, his hand calloused and rough, and touched her face. His thumb brushed the dampness from her cheek. Though she had not been crying, he leaned in, his own forehead pressing against hers. They stayed there, eyes closed, breathing the same cold sage-scented air. "I can wait," he said, his voice a low, gravelly promise. He let her go, but only enough to shift. He lay down on his side, his back to the cold wind, his body a shield. He pulled her down with him, gently, guiding her until she was lying with her back to his front, her head pillowed on his arm. He wrapped the blanket around them both, pulling her tight against him. They were two spoons, fitted together, a single shape in the dark. He was the warmth, the solid wall at her back. He felt her small, cold hand search for his. He found it, lacing his fingers through hers. A firm, grounding grip. It was an intimacy more profound than the kiss, a promise of patience, of shared survival. He leaned his head down, his lips brushing the soft hair at her temple, a kiss so light it was barely a breath. He felt the last of the tension leave her body. She went heavy against him, a sigh of pure, exhausted trust. She brought his hand, still locked with hers, up to her mouth, and he felt the soft, warm press of her lips against his cold, scarred knuckles. "When this is over," she murmured, her voice already thick with the sleep she had been denied for days. "When this is over," he repeated. And they lay like that, holding hands, two survivors wrapped in a single blanket, leaving the promise to smolder between them. A quiet fire against the vast, starry cold. Cheyenne. At 12 o'clock noon, was a city of noise and mud. The main street was a thick, churning soup of slush and manure, choked with freight wagons, horses, and men in heavy coats. The boardwalks were packed. The Haviland Hotel, a 3-story brick behemoth, stood over the chaos like a silent, disapproving judge. The plan began with a single, sharp, metallic clang. Elias Mercer, dressed in filthy canvas trousers, a moth-eaten coat, and reeking of cheap whiskey he'd poured on himself, tripped on the top step of the Haviland. The small, heavy keg of nails he was carrying, a 50-pound weight he was pretending was 100, slipped from his grasp. It did not just fall. He threw it. It crashed onto the polished oak floor of the lobby, rolled 3 feet, and spun, its hoops ringing like a bell. "Damnation!" Elias roared, his voice a slurred, drunken bellow that cut through the genteel quiet of the lobby. My delivery for the judge." The hotel clerk, a thin man with a starched collar, looked up, his face a mask of pure disgust. Every eye in the lobby, the cattlemen, the politicians, the women in their fine hats snapped to Elias. Phase 1 was complete. At that exact moment, 2 blocks away, Clara Finch sat in the back room of her small print shop. She had her portable telegraph key connected by 2 thin, almost invisible wires to the main Cheyenne trunk line that ran past her window. She took a deep breath, a small, grim smile on her face, and began to tap. It was not a message. It was noise. A long, irritating, nonsensical string of dots and dashes, perfectly timed to create maximum interference. Back at the Haviland, Sutton Hale stepped through the door, right past the commotion Elias was creating. She was invisible. She wore a neat, dark skirt, a white shirtwaist, and the official-looking gray vest of a Western Union telegraph operator. She carried a single dispatch clipboard. She marched to the front desk, ignoring Elias, who was now attempting to lift the keg and failing, swearing a blue streak. "Dispatch for Judge Slate," Sutton announced, her voice crisp and clear. "Urgent, from the territorial governor." The clerk was already apoplectic, trying to wave Elias away with one hand. "Give it to me. Miss, I will see he gets—" from the corner of the lobby. The main hotel telegraph began to chatter. Then stop, then chatter nonsense, Clara's interference, dit-dit-da-dit-dit, zit, da-da-dit. The clerk winced as the machine spat out gibberish. Confound it, the line is, please, miss, just give me the... Sir, this is a priority government seal, Sutton said, her voice rising with practiced impatience. I am required to transmit a confirmation of receipt. I cannot do that on a public and clearly faulty line. I must have access to a private key. A private key, the clerk sputtered. We have no... You do, Sutton insisted, pointing up the grand staircase. Judge Slate's personal study. It has a private tap on the main line. I've used it before. Now, please. The clerk was trapped. Behind him, the telegraph was spitting static. In front of him, Elias had just managed to roll the keg into the path of a woman in a silk dress, who shrieked. The clerk's professional veneer cracked. Fine, he snapped at Sutton. Fine, room 301. The study is... Just go and be quiet about it. Sutton nodded, her face impassive. Thank you for your cooperation. She walked past the clerk, past Elias, who gave her a single, glazed, drunken look that held a universe of meaning, and up the stairs. The moment she was out of sight, Josiah Pike moved. He was in the alley behind the hotel. It was a narrow, dark canyon of brick, piled high with empty crates and smelling of sour beer. He looked up. 3 stories. A cast-iron drain pipe, slick with ice, ran from the roof to the ground. Directly above it, a small, frosted glass skylight. The access to the 3rd-floor utility closet. He unwrapped Thomas Sage's climbing hooks. They were brutal, simple. He strapped one to each boot, and 2 smaller ones to his gloved hands. He was a spider. He began to climb, his movements fluid, silent. He did not trust the pipe alone. He used the hooks, biting into the frozen mortar between the bricks, his muscles straining, his breath pluming in the cold. He moved from shadow to shadow, a man reduced to pure, upward motion. Inside, Sutton walked the plush red carpet of the 3rd floor. Room 301, Slate's suite. The main door was locked, but the small, unassuming door next to it, marked study, was not. The clerk had assumed she would wait. She did not. She entered. It was a small, dark room, dominated by a large desk, a telegraph key, and a single, ominous-looking, green and gold floor safe in the corner. The eagle, she whispered. A noise came from above, a soft, scraping sound. She looked up at the ceiling, where a small ventilation grate was set. Josiah was on the roof. He had crossed the flat, tarred surface, moving like a panther. He reached the skylight. It was locked from the inside. He did not hesitate. He unwrapped the cloth from his hand, took a small, sharp punch from his pocket, and pressed it to the corner of the glass. A single, sharp tap. The glass did not shatter. It fractured, a small spider web. He worked with the patience of a safecracker for 2 minutes, removing a single 6-inch triangle of glass. He reached through, unlocked the latch, and opened the skylight. He was not in the study. He was in the utility closet, dark and smelling of lye. He listened. On the other side of the wall, Sutton's breathing. He picked the simple lock on the closet door and stepped into the study. They did not speak. They did not have time. Sutton pointed to the desk. Josiah moved. He pulled out Thomas's false lock plate and his thin steel picks. The desk drawer was a high-quality lock, but not high enough. Josiah's hands, which had climbed a wall of ice, were now impossibly delicate. A click, a snap. He slid the drawer open. Inside, just as Sutton had said, was a small, leather-bound book. Josiah opened it. It was full of numbers. He's arrogant. Josiah breathed. But he's not stupid. It's a key, not the combination itself. Sutton's eyes flew around the room. A Bible on the shelf. A framed picture of Slate's graduating law class. A date. Try the date of the Battle of Gettysburg, she whispered. He's a patriot in his own mind. Josiah tried it. The tumbler clicked. He tried another. Click. He was in. He began to work the main dial of the Eagle. Down in the lobby. Elias was a master of chaos. He was now arguing with two porters, claiming they had insulted him. "I am a purveyor of fine nails," he bellowed. Rook McCready stepped through the front doors. He was not in his duster, but a fine, black wool coat. He looked clean, sharp, and lethal. He saw the commotion and his lip curled. He hated town. He hated fools. He was moving toward the bar when the hotel telegraph key began to chatter again. Rook froze. His head snapped toward the machine. He had heard that tapping before, in the army, during the war. He had known a telegraph operator with that exact hand, that precise, fast, slightly flawed rhythm. A man who was now a woman who ran a small, seditious print shop. "Clara Finch," he whispered. He looked at the clerk. "Where is that interference coming from?" "The whole city line is—" Rook was not listening. He was moving, not up the stairs, but out the door. He was being lured, and he was taking the bait. He was going to the print shop to settle an old score. The main threat was gone. Upstairs, the heavy steel-bolted door of the Eagle safe swung open with a well-oiled, expensive shush. Josiah reached inside. "One book, black, with an eagle." "Here," Sutton said, pulling a nearly identical, pre-distressed book from under her vest, a fake, filled with transcripts of local livestock sales. She had prepared it. They made the swap. Josiah handed her the real, heavy ledger. It was the master record. It was Slate's entire world of crime. It was their freedom. Sutton did not hide it. She walked to the desk, opened a dry goods box marked Inks Nibs, and placed the ledger inside, as if it were a simple ream of paper. Knock, 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 a sharp, impatient rap at the study door. Sutton and Josiah froze. "Miss," a new voice called. "This is the hotel manager. The clerk said you came up here. Is there a problem? The line is quiet now." Sutton looked at Josiah. Josiah looked at the open safe. Downstairs, Elias heard the knock. He saw the manager, a hard-faced man, at the top of the stairs, turning toward Slate's room. He saw the porters closing in on him. The diversion was over. He needed a new one. He needed an exit. "Ah, to hell with it," Elias roared. But his voice was different, clearer, angrier. In a feat of pure, adrenaline-fueled strength, he grabbed the 50-pound keg of nails, ripped it from the floor, and settled it onto his shoulder. I'll take my business elsewhere," he yelled. He stumbled backward, right into the two porters, scattering them like ninepins. Then, he did the last thing anyone expected. He ran, a drunken man, carrying an impossibly heavy keg, sprinting through the lobby of the Haviland Hotel. It was a moment of pure, glorious chaos. He crashed into a potted palm, sending dirt and fronds everywhere. He sideswiped a table of drinking glasses. The manager, hearing the crash, abandoned the door upstairs and bellowed, "Stop that man! Stop him!" The entire hotel staff, the manager included, streamed down the stairs, drawn by this new, spectacular disaster. In the study, the door was forgotten. "Now," Josiah whispered. He moved to the open safe, swung the heavy door, and spun the dial. He moved to the desk, replacing the lock plate with Thomas's false one. It looked, to a casual glance, perfectly locked. He went to the closet, stepped inside, and gave Sutton a single nod. Sutton picked up the ink box. She walked to the study door, opened it, and stepped into the hall. The manager, the staff, everyone was gone, their voices echoing from the lobby below. Clang, clang, clang! From 2 blocks away, clear and sharp in the noon air. 3 bells. Clara's signal. Run! Sutton did not run. She walked, with purpose, down the grand staircase. She saw the wreckage. Elias was gone, having burst through the side doors, leading a chase. She walked out the main entrance, invisible once more. Josiah was already in the alley, sliding down the drain pipe. They met, as planned, in the mouth of the alley. "Where?" Josiah panted. Sutton pointed. A train of 3 massive Conestoga wagons, piled high with white sacks of flour. was pulling out, heading west. The last wagon. They did not speak. They ran, heads down, just 2 more citizens in a hurry. They grabbed the tailgate, hauled themselves up, and disappeared, burrowing deep into the cool, dusty, sweet-smelling sacks of flour. They were gone. Just as the wagon train cleared the edge of town, a fine black carriage, pulled by 2 matching black horses, pulled up to the Haviland. The chaos of Elias's escape was still settling. The carriage door opened. Judge Byron Slate, in a black frock coat, stepped out. He had not been in the hotel. He had not been at the courthouse. He had been at the bank, signing the last of the foreclosure papers for a small, worthless ranch in Thunder Basin. He sensed the disarray. He saw the fear on his clerk's face. He looked up at the window of his study, 3 floors above, and then his gaze followed the street, settling on the cloud of dust kicked up by the departing flour wagons. His face, which had been a mask of pleasant, judicial authority, turned into something else, something cold and ancient and utterly without mercy. He knew. The new courthouse was a scar of raw, yellow pine in the center of Cheyenne. It had been built in 3 days, a temporary box to hold a temporary justice, and the entire room smelled of fresh sawn wood and the wet, wool and mud stink of the crowd packed inside. Every seat was taken. Men stood 3 deep against the walls. Martha Coulter, a woman whose gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a bun as severe as her reputation, stood before the new, traveling federal judge. "Your Honor," her voice was clear, cutting through the murmurs, "the defense calls for the immediate seizure of a piece of evidence, a black, leather-bound ledger, currently in the possession of the U.S. Marshal, who took it from my client, Miss Sutton Hale, for its protection." The Marshal, a tall, grim man with a sweeping mustache, produced the book. The golden eagle on its cover seemed to catch the weak light, a mocking symbol. "We ask that the Marshal, and only the Marshal, retain custody of this book for the duration of these proceedings," Martha said, her eyes flicking to the local deputies who stood near Judge Slate. Byron Slate himself was not in his robes. He sat at the defendant's table, dressed in a finer black suit than any other man in the room. He looked, Elias thought from his seat in the back, less like a prisoner and more like a king holding court in a lesser room. Slate rose, and a hush fell. His voice was not a shout. It was a smooth, oiled instrument of pure authority. "Your Honor, this is a farce. That book is my personal, private property, stolen from my hotel suite by a disgruntled and clearly unstable former employee." He gestured to Sutton, who sat beside Martha, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "This woman has engaged in a campaign of slander, stealing and fabricating documents to ruin my good name. I demand the charges of theft be read against her." "The charges will be noted," the federal judge said, his voice dry. "But we are here to investigate the claims against you, Judge Slate, Martha Coulter. Your case rests on this book. Can you prove what is in it?" "We can, Your Honor," Martha said. "The prosecution calls Miss Sutton Hale to the stand." A wave of whispers. Sutton stood, walked to the stand. Her legs felt like water, but her back was a rod of steel. Martha laid out Sutton's small, coded notebooks. "Miss Hale, are these your notes?" "Yes, ma'am, taken in the course of my duties." "And this?" Martha held up the single sheet of paper. "Is this the key to your personal shorthand?" "It is." "And that ledger?" Martha pointed to the book in the marshal's hands. "Is that the book from which you were forced to transcribe?" "It is." "Then, Miss Hale," Martha's voice was gentle, but strong, "please read for the jury. Let us start with page 34, an entry dated March 9th. The marshal opened the book. Sutton was given her cipher key. Her voice was a small, trembling thing at first. "Entry, March 9th, payer Central Mining. Amount 10,000, gold, service lost, lost claim verdict. Payee B. Slate." A murmur went through the crowd. She continued, her voice gaining strength. the practiced rhythm of her profession taking over. She was a stenographer again. She was just reading the facts. Entry, April 2nd. Payer, Wyoming Stockman's Bank. Amount $5,000. Service foreclosure. Thunder Basin. Mercer. Elias felt his stomach clench. It was there, his own ruin. A line item in a book. It was then that the first sound came from outside. A single whooping yell, followed by the deafening crack of a .45 revolver being fired into the air. The courtroom flinched. The judge banged his gavel. Order, Marshal. See to that. But the noise was just beginning. Rook McCready and 5 of his men had been drinking at the saloon across the street, waiting. Now they spilled into the muddy road, drunk, furious, and armed. They can't try the judge, Rook roared, waving his bottle. He's the law. He fired again, shattering the window of the land office. Chaos erupted. Women screamed. Men dived for the boardwalk. Across the street, in the shadowed doorway of a feed store, Elias and Josiah Pike exchanged a single, grim look. This was what they had feared. The civilians, Elias said, his voice a low growl. Get them clear. They didn't draw their guns. They were not lawmen. They were shepherds. They moved, grabbing a woman and her child, shoving them through the door of the feed store. Inside, get down. Stay away from the windows, Elias yelled. Josiah, a full head taller than anyone in the crowd, moved like a linebacker, creating a path, funneling the panicked townspeople into the solid brick structures. Inside the courthouse, Sutton was still reading, her voice shaking but insistent. Entry, May 1st, Payer R. McCready. Service Sweetwater. Witness removal. Outside, one of McCready's men, drunk and bold, saw Elias shoving a man into the store. Hey, it's that farmer, the one from the creek. He was not shooting at the sky. He was aiming. He raised his pistol and fired. Elias had just pushed an old woman through the doorway. He felt the shot before he heard it. A white-hot, tearing line of fire across his left shoulder. It felt like being struck by a blacksmith's hammer. He grunted a deep, animal sound and stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. He looked down. A dark, spreading stain was blooming on the sleeve of his duster. He was hit. From the witness stand, Sutton had a clear view through the courthouse window. She heard the specific shot. She saw the chaos, and then she saw him. She saw Elias stagger. She saw him clutch his arm. She saw the dark stain. In that instant, every trace of fear, every tremor in her hands, every doubt, was burned away. It was replaced by a pure, glacial, and clarifying rage. Her spine became steel. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was a bell. And on page 92, she said, her voice rising, cutting through the chaos, her eyes locking on Byron's slate. A final list. Outstanding accounts. 4 names. Slate, who had been watching the chaos outside with a small, calculating smile, looked at her. The smile froze. Silas Croft, surveyor. Sutton read, her voice filling the room. Mary and John Beale, homesteaders, and my own name, Sutton Hale, stenographer. She let the silence hang for a heartbeat. Then she delivered the killing blow, her gaze never leaving Slate's. And beside my name, Judge, your own handwriting. A single word. Immediate. The courtroom exploded. It was a confession. An order for her murder. Read aloud. Byron Slate saw his world end. He saw the jury, their faces masks of horror. He saw the federal judge, his eyes like chips of ice. He saw the marshal, his hand already on his weapon. Slate did not go down. He was a cornered wolf. He lunged, not for the door, but for the local deputy, his deputy standing near the wall. With a snarl, Slate ripped the deputy's revolver from its holster. I am the law, he screamed, his face a purple mask of rage, swinging the gun toward Sutton. He never aimed. The U.S. Marshal was a blur. He did not fire. He moved in 2 long strides. His hand, holding a heavy, leather-wrapped sap, came down in a single, brutal arc, shattering Slate's wrist. The gun clattered to the pine floor. 2 other marshals were on him, slamming him face first onto the defendant's table. His shriek of pain cut off. "Byron Slate, you are under federal arrest," the marshal roared. "Outside!" Rook McCready heard the scream. He saw the marshals in the doorway. He knew, with a coyote's instinct, that the game was over. The trap was shut. "Scatter!" he bellowed to his men. And he ran. Elias saw him. His shoulder was a symphony of fire. But this was not over. He saw the man who had put the mark on Sutton's neck, the man who had just sent a bullet into him. He did not think. He moved. "Elias, your arm!" Josiah yelled. But Elias was already in a dead sprint, his legs pumping, his good right arm swinging for balance. He chased Rook down the main street. He saw the man's head, turning, his face a mask of panicked rage. Rook was fast, but he was a brawler. Elias was a rancher, fueled by years of silent rage and a final, pure purpose. The chase ended at the edge of town, on the bridge spanning Dry Creek. The creek was swollen with melted snow, a fast, muddy torrent. Rook, seeing he was cornered, skidded to a stop, turning on the rattling wooden planks. He drew his Bowie knife. "Come on, farmer, come and die, I'll gut you." Elias didn't stop. He didn't slow. He didn't draw a weapon. He slammed into Rook like a freight train. It was not a fight. It was a collision. They crashed, hard, into the splintered wooden railing. The old wood groaned. A sharp, cracking sound. Rook, a practiced knife fighter, slashed, the blade opening a shallow cut on Elias's good forearm. Elias didn't even feel it. He just hit him. A solid, heavy fist to the jaw, then another to the gut. The railing snapped. Rook stumbled backward, his arms windmilling. He was at the very edge. His foot slipped. He lost the knife. It flew from his grasp in a silver arc, disappearing into the black, churning water below. He fell, not into the creek, but onto the muddy bank, his legs dangling over the edge. He was weaponless, beaten. He looked up, spitting blood, at Elias, who stood over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from 2 wounds. "Go on," Rook spat, a bloody smile on his face. "Finish it! Do it!" Elias looked at the man. He saw the raw mark on Sutton's neck. He saw the smoking hole in his duster. His right hand clenched into a fist, white-knuckled. He raised it high, to bring it down, to finish this, to end it. He paused. The fist trembled. "My father, a man who saw weakness, and he fed on it. He would not—" His breath came out in a long, shuddering sigh. The fist uncurled. He would not grant this man an escape. He fumbled for the coil of rope at his belt, his one good hand clumsy. "Get up," Elias said, his voice a low rasp. Rook stared, confused. Elias grabbed him by the collar, spun him, and with a series of savage, efficient jerks, tied his hands. "You'll stand trial," Elias panted. "The law you mocked, that's justice." He turned, pulling the man, and stopped. She was there. Sutton was standing at the end of the bridge, her coat clutched around her shoulders. The sky had opened, a cold, fine rain beginning to fall. Her face was pale, streaked with mud and tears. She saw the blood. She saw the bound man. She saw Elias standing, alive. She ran. She didn't stop at the rope. She came right up to him, her hands flying to his face, her palms cold and wet against his skin. Her eyes were wide, frantic, searching his— "Your shoulder, your—" He let go of the rope. Rook slumped to the mud, forgotten. Elias covered her hands with his own, pressing her palms hard against his face, holding himself steady, anchoring himself to her. She looked at the blood on his shirt, then back to his eyes, the courtroom, the ledger, the entire world of Byron Slate. It all dissolved. There was only the sound of the rain, the creek, and her. "Don't leave me," she whispered. A broken, ragged sound, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "Don't you ever—" "Leave me." He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against hers. "I am here," he breathed. "I am here." The federal marshal's gavel came down, not in a courtroom, but in the center of the Cheyenne Bank. the ruling was swift and final. With Judge Byron Slate in federal chains, awaiting transport to a prison he would never leave. His network had collapsed. The Wyoming Stockman's Bank was declared insolvent, its assets frozen, its predatory contracts nullified. The foreclosure notice on Elias Mercer's ranch, which Slate had signed just hours before, was now just a worthless piece of paper. The news rippled through the valley like a warm chinook. The spell of fear, which had held the territory in a frozen grip for years, was broken. Spring came, and then a summer of astonishing, improbable life. It was as if the land itself, freed from Slate's shadow, could finally breathe. The people of Thunder Basin, who had lived by looking away, now looked toward each other. They came to Elias's ranch, not as a group, but one by one, a shy, practical pilgrimage. Josiah Pike, now the valley's official and only freight runner, arrived with a wagon loaded with good pine lumber. Paid for, he'd said with a gruff smile, by an anonymous donation from a former cavalry fund. Thomas Sage came, his canvas satchel clinking. He said nothing, but spent a day rehanging the barn doors with hinges so perfectly balanced they would outlast the wood. Other ranchers, men Elias had only ever nodded to at the feed store, showed up with sacks of seed grain, a crate of chickens, and 3 healthy, lowing heifers. They were rebuilding his ranch, not with charity, but with back pay, as one old-timer put it. Clara Finch, her print shop, now the busiest in the county, took over the abandoned saloon. She whitewashed the walls, threw out the broken tables, and set up a proper school. In the evenings, the building was filled with light, and Clara's voice could be heard teaching men who had only ever signed their name with an X how to read a newspaper. Sutton Hale taught alongside her. She had a row of desks in the back, and she taught the young men and women of the valley the one skill that could get them a job with the railroad or the telegraph office, her shorthand. She was patient, she was precise, and she was, for the first time in her life, profoundly, deeply happy. She and Elias were rebuilding, not just the ranch. They were rebuilding the silent, broken parts of themselves. They worked side by side, from the cold gray of dawn until the purple dusk. They spoke of fences, of water rights, of the price of grain. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of the promise made on a cold hillside. They lived in the practical, healing, day-to-day present. They lived under the same roof, but they were a rancher and his partner. He slept on his cot. She slept in the small, new room he had built for her, the one that smelled of fresh pine. The promise, "I can wait," was a living thing between them, a point of silent, profound respect. And then, one night in late July, the sky broke. A summer storm, building for days in the high peaks, finally unleashed itself. It was not the dry, scouring ice of that first blizzard, but a warm, torrential, life-giving deluge. The rain came down in solid, deafening sheets, drumming on the new tin roof of the barn, a sound like 1,000 stampeding horses. A new calf had been born that afternoon, small and weak. Elias said he would stay in the barn to make sure it and its mother were safe. He lit a storm lantern, its yellow light a small, steady beacon in the vast, roaring darkness. He was kneeling in the sweet-smelling hay, checking the calf's breathing. When the barn door slid open, Sutton stood there, silhouetted against the gray. Streaming rain. She was soaked. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her thin cotton dress was clinging to her. She was carrying a heavy wool blanket, the old one, the tattered blue-gray blanket from his cabin, the one that had been torn in two, the one she had painstakingly, lovingly, stitched back together. "You should not be out in this," he said, his voice rough, standing up. "Neither should you," she replied. Her voice was quiet, but it carried, even over the roar of the rain on the tin. She closed the heavy door, shutting out the storm, sealing them inside. The barn was suddenly a pocket of profound, warm silence. The only sounds were the deafening, comforting drum of the rain, the soft munching of the cattle, and the fast, shallow beat of his own heart. She walked toward him, the lantern light catching the raindrops in her hair like a spray of diamonds. She did not stop. She came right up to him, close enough that he could smell the rain on her skin and the clean, sweet scent of the soap she used. "I came," she said, her voice a low, unsteady whisper, "to see the calf." "The calf is fine," he said, his voice thick. He could not move. He could not breathe. "I know," she said. Her eyes were fixed on his. She was not the terrified runaway from the storm. She was not the fierce witness in the courtroom. She was Sutton, and the fear was gone. This was her moment, the one she had chosen. She did not reach for him. She reached for his shoulder. Her hand, small and warm, went to the scar, the place where the bullet had torn through him. She touched it, her fingers tracing the healed, puckered flesh through the thin cotton of his shirt. It was a gesture of profound, aching tenderness, a healing of the wound he had taken for her. He felt the touch like a brand, a jolt that went straight to his core. He closed his eyes, his hand coming up to cover hers, pressing her palm flat against the scar. "Sutton," he breathed, the name a prayer, an agony of waiting. She moved her other hand, placing it on his chest, right over his heart. She had done it once before, in the cold, to feel the steady beat of his life. Now, she felt the wild, hammering thunder of his desire, a rhythm that matched her own. "It is loud again. Elias Mercer," she whispered. He could not speak. He leaned in, his forehead finding hers, just as they had done on that cold hillside. But this was not the cold. This was the warm, sweet-smelling dark. "It has been waiting for you," he rescaled. He kissed her, and it was not the frantic collision at the creek or the slow, burning discovery by the fire. It was a homecoming. It was a lifetime of want, a lifetime of loneliness, poured into a single, devastatingly gentle kiss. It was slow and deep and sure. It was the rain, and the earth, and the dark. Her cloak, the one she had thrown over her wet dress, slid from her shoulders, landing in a soft, dark pool in the golden hay. He broke the kiss, but only to look at her, to see her. Her face was illuminated by the lantern, her lips parted, her eyes dark, bottomless pools. He saw the question in them, a last, lingering trace of the world that had hurt her. He knew what he had to ask. He knew what she needed to hear. He put his hands on her shoulders, his grip gentle, grounding her. "Sutton," he whispered, his voice shaking with the weight of the question. "Are you sure?" She didn't answer immediately. A slow, radiant, breathtaking smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, without fear, without reservation. It was a sunrise. She answered him. She leaned in, her lips brushing his. "I am sure," she whispered. Then she took his hand, her fingers lacing with his, and gently pulled him down. They sank into the deep, clean pile of hay, a soft, golden nest in the lantern light. She lay back, pulling him with her, and her smile never left her face. She reached for the old, mended, blue jewel blanket, the one that had been their first bond, their shield against the cold. She pulled it up, not to her chin, but just over their shoulders, a canopy against the world, a new roof for a new home. They loved each other. It was not a firestorm. It was a slow, deep, burning ember. It was a conversation, spoken in the language of gentle hands, and soft, breathless sighs, and long, lingering looks. It was the profound, aching relief of two survivors who had finally found the shore. It was the delight in discovering the shape of her shoulder, the feel of his calloused hand on her skin, the taste of his mouth. It was stopping, just to look, to see the smile in her eyes, to feel the reverence in his touch. The rain hammered on the roof, a wild, passionate drumbeat that was the soundtrack to their quiet, sacred, long-awaited union. There was no fear. There was no pain. There was only the rain and the warm hay and the steady, miraculous beating of two hearts, finally in the same place, finally at peace. Later, much later, The storm had passed. The rain had softened to a gentle, quiet dripping from the eaves. The only sound was the breathing of the cattle and the new, content silence. Sutton lay with her head on his arm, her body fitted against his side, the mended blanket still draped over them. She was listening to the rain fade, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart under her ear. He was not asleep. He was watching the way the pale gray light of the pre-dawn was beginning to filter through the cracks in the barn wall. He felt her stir, her hand tracing a lazy, content circle on his chest. He leaned down, his lips finding her hair. He made the promise, the one that mattered. Every sunrise after this, he whispered, his voice a low, permanent vow. Every single one, I will be here. She tipped her head back, her eyes finding his in the soft, gray light. And I, she whispered, will be here. Dawn over Thunder Basin was not merely a time of day. It was a verdict. After the judgment of the storm, the trial of the ledger, and the healing of the rain, the world had been handed back, scrubbed new and clean. The air was cool, carrying the sharp, medicinal scent of wet sage and the sweet, resinous smell of the pine Elias had been splitting for the new roof. A silver mist clung to the low hollows, and the wild grasses were tipped with a million points of light. Far to the east, the peaks of the Laramie Range, which had once been a wall of purple shadow, a barrier of menace, were now just mountains. They caught the first pale, horizontal light, the granite blushing. They were the color of a rose, then of pale fire, the soft, glowing pink of a banked coal, promising warmth, not destruction. Sutton stepped onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the cool, damp wood. She had risen before him, had washed her face in the basin. Her dark hair, no longer pinned in the severe knot of a courthouse stenographer, was braided, damp and loose, down her back. In her hand, she carried the small, dark leather satchel. It had been her anchor in the blizzard, a dead weight of terror and obligation, the physical manifestation of her fear. She had clutched it against the ice. She had hidden it under her cot. Now, it was just leather and paper. Inside, the judge's thick black ledger, sealed and stamped by the federal marshal, was just a book, a history that was, finally, finished. A copy had gone to Washington. A copy had been filed with the territorial court, and the original, by some strange twist of law, had been returned to her. It was her property, the proof of her labor. Elias had built a small, sturdy shelf by the cabin door, meant for boots and tools. Sutton walked to it. She did not throw the satchel. She did not hide it. She placed it, a conscious, deliberate act of storage, a tool whose use had passed. The past was now locked away, put on a shelf, visible but no longer carried. She stepped off the porch, her feet touching the damp earth. The cabin door was open, and from inside came the sound of men's voices, the clink of tin cups, and the rich, dark smell of coffee. The ranchers who had come to help finish the new barn roof, the men who had once looked away, were gathered, mugs in hand, waiting for the full light. They stopped their low conversation when she entered, hats respectfully in their hands. They knew her as the quiet woman from Cheyenne, the one who had stood beside Elias, the one who had brought the storm and, somehow, the peace that followed. She paused, letting the moment settle. She looked at them, one by one. She was not a fugitive. She was not a witness. She was not a victim. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and warm in the small, crowded room. "Thank you for coming." She poured a cup of coffee for herself. "I am Sutton Hale." It was the first time she had introduced herself where the name was not a lie, a correction, or a confession. It was a statement. "I am." The men, understanding the subtle, profound shift, nodded. "Ma'am." One of them, a grizzled old rancher with his own foreclosure story, said, his voice gruff, "Good to see you, Miss Hale." They returned to their coffee, the acceptance as simple and as solid. as the floorboards. Elias was at the table, his back to the stove. He had his own ledger open, not a book of secrets, but his old, worn book of burdens, the thin, oil-stained notebook that detailed every cent he owed, every bag of feed bought on credit, every nail. Beside it lay a crisp, official paper from the New Laramie Bank. It was not forgiveness. It was a chance, a restructuring, based on the collapse of Slate's network and the sworn testimony of the entire valley. A new, fair loan at 4% with a 5-year term. He dipped his pen in the ink, made a single, final entry in the old book, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he closed the cover. A life of subtraction was over. He looked up as Sutton stood beside him, her presence a warmth at his side. He saw the empty shelf on the porch through the open door, and the place where the satchel had been. He did not say a word about it. He just lifted his hand, palm up, offering it to her. She took it. His hand was rough, scarred from the rope and the bullet and the work. Hers was smooth, with a new, permanent line of ink on the side of her finger. They fit. A wagon rattled into the yard, a new sound of life. The laughter that followed it was a strange, welcome music. Clara Finch, Josiah Pike, and Thomas Sage had arrived. They were not allies in a war anymore. They were neighbors, coming to help with the roof. "We brought supplies," Clara said, her sharp, intelligent face bright with a smile. She held up a small, pristine box of chalk, a treasure in this valley. "For the evening classes, we cannot have the future of Wyoming growing up unable to spell telegraph. It is simply not civilized." Josiah, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, unrolled a small 48-star flag, still stiff with newness. "Every official business," he said, his voice rumbling with a rare, deep humor, "requires government approval, and as the official freight runner, I approve." He planted the small flag in the flour barrel by the steps, where it hung, bright and ridiculous, in the morning air. Thomas Sage, as always, said nothing. He simply walked to the new, tall gatepost Elias had set at the entrance to the ranch yard. He carried a long, freshly oiled plank of pine. He had been working on it for a week, in the quiet of his forge. He hung it from 2 small, perfectly wrought iron S-hooks. The lettering was not painted on, to be washed away by the first blizzard. It was carved deep, burned black, made to last as long as the wood itself. Mercer Hale Stock Station, and beneath it, in a smaller, elegant script, telegraph classes at dusk. Elias stood beside Sutton, looking at the sign. His face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the letters. He cleared his throat. He was a man who could face a blizzard, who could chase a gunman, but this public declaration was harder. That was Thomas's idea, he said, his voice rough, awkward. He was not looking at her, but at the sign. "But if you want, if it suits you, they can call this place by both names." He was not just talking about the sign. He was offering her a partnership, a name, a home, all of it, in one clumsy, beautiful sentence. Sutton turned from the doorway. She did not answer him immediately. Her gaze went to the rocking chair by the now cold stove. Draped over its back was the old, blue-gray wool blanket. It was clean, and the ragged, L-shaped tear was now a neat, if thick, seam of black thread, a scar, mended. She walked to it. She touched the mended scar, her fingers tracing the path of her own needle. "That night," she said, her voice soft, full of a memory that no longer hurt. "This was your last blanket, the last warmth you had in the world. You tore it in two for a stranger." She turned to look at him, her eyes holding his. "But for me, Elias, it was my first beginning, the first real kindness, the first choice that was not made in fear, but in hope. It was the first thing that felt like home." She closed the small distance between them. He was still, a mountain of a man, waiting for her verdict. She reached up, placing her hand on his chest, over his heart. It was steady, slow, a home. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, her voice a warm whisper meant only for him. a vow to answer his, "I choose to stay, alias, with my real name and with my real heart." He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding since that first night of the storm. His arm, the one that had been wounded, the one she had tended, went around her waist, pulling her close. And then, from far in the distance, a new sound cut through the clear morning air. It was not a howl. It was not a gunshot. It was the long, mournful, powerful wail of a train whistle, rolling across the basin. The Iron Road was coming. A new era was arriving, one that would change the West forever. An age of telegraphs and steel, of schedules and contracts, an age where a man like Slate could be brought down by a woman's coded notes. They stood in the doorway of the small cabin, bathed in the golden morning sun. Elias Mercer and Sutton Hale. They did not look at the train. They looked at each other. He clasped her hand, their fingers locking together. They were ready. They were ready to build a life, to build a home, in the very place where the blizzard had tried to end one. And there, in the quiet, with the sun on their faces, the story closes, but for them, in the silence that followed, in the whisper that was yet to come, a new one was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. Please let us know in the comments and share any thoughts you have. It means the world to us. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and if you can, support us by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.